Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing something a little different. We are not looking at a polished contemporary bestseller or even a viral article from last week.
No?
We are looking at a transcript, a raw transcript of a series of lectures that were delivered back in March of 1986.
And we really have to set the scene here, because the setting, the context, is almost as important as the text itself.
It's everything.
These weren't lectures given in some comfortable, climate-controlled auditorium at Harvard or Oxford.
At all.
These were delivered in Managua, Nicaragua.
That's right, Managua.
And just to be clear, March 1986 in Nicaragua. I mean, that is not a vacation destination.
No, it was the absolute eye of the storm. It was the height of the Contra War.
Right.
You had this small, really impoverished country that was effectively under siege. It was facing a crushing economic embargo and daily paramilitary attacks.
All funded and organized by the United States.
All funded and organized by the United States. And into this environment, this pressure cooker, walks Noam Chomsky, a linguist from MIT, to talk about the philosophy of power.
It feels incredibly high stakes. I mean, usually when we read political theory or philosophy, it feels abstract. It's an intellectual exercise.
Sure.
But here, the theory Chomsky is discussing is literally happening right outside the window.
Yes.
The systems of power he's analyzing are the ones dropping bombs on the people in the audience.
That is precisely why we chose this source material for the Crisis in Perception project. The book is titled On Power and Ideology, the Managua Lectures. And the reason it matters so much today, decades later with the Cold War long over, is because Chomsky isn't just talking about Nicaragua. He's not just talking about the 1980s. He's laying out a blueprint.
A blueprint of what exactly?
Of institutional logic. He's asking a fundamental, systemic question. How do modern states, and he's focusing on the United States, given its position as a superpower, how do they use ideology to legitimize their power?
While at the same time, keeping the public out of the loop.
While effectively excluding the public from any kind of meaningful influence. That's the core of it.
That really is the heart of it, isn't it? It's about that gap between what we're told is happening, we're promoting democracy, we're defending freedom, and what the system is actually designed to do.
Precisely. And so our mission today is to really unpack that machine. We are not here to relitigate the 1980s. This is not a partisan debate about Republicans versus Democrats.
Yeah.
We are looking at the structure. We want to understand the durable structures that link foreign policy, media narratives, and economic power. Because those structures, they didn't just vanish when the Berlin Wall fell.
They just got a new coat of paint.
You could say that, yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into that context a bit more before we get to the mechanics.
Yeah.
You mentioned Managua, 1986. Chomsky goes there to speak to intellectuals, activists, people who are living through this war. But I have to ask the obvious question.
Go ahead.
Why go there? He's Noam Chomsky. He has a platform. Why not just publish an op-ed in the New York Times or, give a speech in Boston?
Well, it's a bitter irony, and it's something Chomsky points out very early in the lectures. He notes that while the United States is, legally speaking, a very free society,
Sure, freedom of speech.
perhaps the most free in the world in terms of, a lack of direct state coercion. There's no secret police knocking on your door for saying the wrong thing.
Right.
But the ideological control, the control over the realm of acceptable thought is so strong that certain topics are just effectively marginalized.
So you're saying he had to go to an active war zone to speak freely?
In a very real sense, yes. He wanted to engage directly with the victims of the policy he was analyzing. At that specific moment, the International Court of Justice, the World Court, was just about to condemn the United States for the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua.
Which is pretty much international legal jargon for terrorism.
It is, essentially. The court ordered the U.S. to cease its crimes and pay massive reparations.
And how was that covered back in the U.S.?
It was largely dismissed. It was framed as, the court being a hostile forum or simply irrelevant. The major channels of communication, the mainstream media, they simply wouldn't host a serious discussion about whether the U.S. was, in fact, acting as a rogue state.
So to have that serious discussion.
He goes to Managua. He goes to discuss the reality that was being so carefully obscured back home.
Okay. So if we had to write the central thesis of these lectures on the back of a napkin, and I know that's the challenge for a Chomsky book, what would it be?
I think you can boil it down to this. U.S. foreign policy is not random. It's structured to protect a very specific international economic order.
An order that benefits U.S. business.
The primary goal is to ensure that resources, markets, labor, that all of it is available to U.S.-based corporations. And ideology, meaning the media, the school system, political rhetoric, its function is to conceal this reality from the American public.
So ideology is the story we tell ourselves.
It's the story that frames aggression as defense. It frames forcing a country to submit as promoting democracy.
That's a heavy claim. Aggression as defense.
Yeah.
It sounds like something straight out of Orwell.
It is Orwellian, and he uses that term quite a bit. But he argues it's not a conspiracy of, a few men in a dark room. It's a system. It's how the institutions function. And to really understand that system, we have to start with what he calls the fifth freedom.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think most of us, if we paid attention to history class, we've heard of the four freedoms.
Right, FDR.
FDR, World War II. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. It's supposed to be the bedrock of American idealism.
It is. Those are the ones you hear about in civics class. They're very noble goals on paper. But Chomsky argues there's an unspoken fifth freedom that, in practice, trumps all of them.
And that is?
The freedom to rob and exploit.
Okay, hold on. That sounds a little crude. It sounds like a cartoon villain's motivation, the freedom to rob.
It does.
If we look at the actual planning documents that Chomsky is citing, surely it's not phrased that way.
No, you're right. In the internal language of State Department planners, it's not called robbery. It's discussed in much more clinical bureaucratic terms. They called it maintaining the grand area.
The grand area.
Yeah.
That sounds almost imperial.
It is. You should think of it as a master plan. In the 1940s, as World War II was ending, U.S. planners at the Council on Foreign Relations and the State Department sat down and very rationally calculated exactly how much of the globe the U.S. economy needed to control to maintain its overwhelming supremacy.
It's like a corporation calculating its total addressable market.
That is the perfect analogy. And they concluded that this grand area had to include, at a minimum, the Western Hemisphere, the Far East, and the former British Empire, including the energy resources of the Middle East.
In the world.
Most of the non-Soviet world. And the fifth freedom is simply the operational demand that within this grand area, nothing, not a local law, not a labor union, and certainly not a sovereign government, is allowed to impede the free movement and operation of U.S. capital.
So when we learn about the four freedoms in school, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, those are for the citizens.
Right. The four freedoms are for you and me. The fifth freedom is for the corporate structure.
And the central argument in these lectures is that when the fifth freedom comes into conflict with the other four,
the fifth freedom wins. Every single time.
So give me a concrete example. When a country says, actually, we'd rather use our land to grow food for our own people instead of, say, bananas for a U.S. fruit company, that's a violation of the fifth freedom.
Exactly. And that right there is the crucial pivot point in the entire system. In this framework, if a country resists the fifth freedom, if they dare to prioritize their own population over the demands of the global economic order, they immediately become an enemy.
Regardless of their own politics.
It doesn't matter if they're fascists, socialists, Democrats, or priests. The ideological label is less important than the economic action. If you impede the flow of resources or capital, you become a problem that needs to be solved.
This leads us directly to one of the most, I think, fascinating concepts in the book.
Right.
Honestly, it's one that completely changed how I look at international news.
The rotten apple theory.
The rotten apple, yeah. This is essential.
It is.
But I have to play devil's advocate for a minute, because usually when we hear about the U.S. intervening in some small country like Grenada in the 80s or Laos or Nicaragua, the official story is always that they pose a threat to the United States.
Of course, a national security threat.
But you look at a map and you just think, how? I mean, Nicaragua is tiny, it's impoverished, it doesn't have nuclear weapons, it barely has an army that can defend its own borders.
Right.
The U.S., on the other hand, has thousands of nuclear warheads and the most powerful military in human history. So how on earth does a nation of peasants threaten a superpower?
Right.
It seems absurd on its face.
It does sound absurd if you think about it only in military terms, and that's why looking at the internal planning documents is so vital. Chomsky isn't guessing here. He's quoting them directly.
What do they say?
The planners, people like George Kennan, explicitly noted that the danger wasn't that Nicaragua would invade Texas. The danger was, and I quote, nationalist regimes that are responsive to popular pressures for improvement in the low living standards of the masses.
responsive to popular pressures.
Yeah.
I mean, that just sounds like democracy, a government that does what its people want rather than what an external power wants.
Precisely. And that's the real threat. Chomsky argues it's the demonstration effect.
The threat of a good example.
Exactly. Imagine you are running a global empire based on the premise that there is no alternative to your system of corporate-led development. Then along comes this tiny, impoverished nation with virtually no resources, and they somehow manage to create a functional society outside your control.
They start building schools, they reduce illiteracy.
They feed their poor, they improve healthcare, they carry out land reform.
And they do it all without following the U.S. playbook.
Right. If they succeed, even a little bit, it completely destroys the argument that you need U.S. corporate dominance to survive and develop. That is the rotten apple. It's not a military threat. It's an ideological virus.
A virus of independence.
And viruses can spread. That's the core fear. If Nicaragua can successfully chart its own course, maybe Guatemala will try it next, then maybe Brazil. The rot is the idea of independence itself. And the planner's deepest fear is that this rot will spread to countries that actually do have resources the U.S. really cares about, like oil or strategic minerals.
So the rotten apple isn't a missile silo in the jungle. It's a successful literacy program.
That is the profound irony of it all. He cites an Oxfam report in the lectures. Now, Oxfam is a mainstream charitable development agency, not some radical group.
Right, very respectable.
And they reported that Nicaragua was, quote, exceptional among the 76 developing countries where they worked.
Exceptional in what way?
In the government's commitment to improving the lives of the poor, they were actually making incredible progress on health and education despite the war. And Chomsky argues that that right there was the unforgivable crime.
Because if they succeed, the fifth freedom is threatened everywhere.
So the rational policy response, if your primary goal is maintaining the grand area, is to destroy that example. You have to crush it. You have to debilitate the country. You have to make the economy scream, to borrow a phrase Richard Nixon used regarding Chile.
You have to guarantee that the example fails.
You have to turn that good example back into a basket case. So you can then point to it and say to the rest of the world, see, independence leads to misery. Socialism doesn't work. You need us.
That is, well, it completely recontextualizes the entire rhetoric of the Cold War.
Yeah.
I mean, everything back then, every intervention was framed as fighting communism.
It was. But to understand the system, we need to look at how Chomsky decodes the word communist.
It's part of the systems theology, as he calls it.
Right. It's like a religious term. In the U.S. doctrinal system, communist doesn't necessarily mean you've read Marx or that you take orders from Moscow.
So what does it mean in practice?
In practice, it refers to any nationalist movement that prioritizes its own population over the demands of the global economic order. A priest organizing landless peasants to ask for better wages can be labeled a communist.
A democratically elected leader who wants to nationalize the copper mines.
Definitely a communist. Any force that represents that rotten apple tendency, that threat of a good example, has to be labeled as communist to justify destroying it.
So anti-communist doesn't really mean anti-authoritarian. It just means pro-fifth freedom.
In practice, yes. This explains the apparent contradiction of why the U.S. could support the most brutal, murderous dictatorships. Somoza in Nicaragua, Pinochet in Chile, the Shah in Iran, Suharto in Indonesia, and call them friends or even members of the free world.
They weren't free by any stretch of the imagination.
No, but they kept their countries open to the fifth freedom. They were reliable. They allowed the extraction of resources and the exploitation of labor. That was the only freedom that mattered.
And the communists were the ones trying to close that door.
Exactly.
I want to pivot for a second to the domestic side of this system, because Chomsky doesn't just look at foreign policy. He looks at how this whole apparatus sustains itself at home. And he talks about national security in a way that I found really surprising.
You mean the economic angle?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all conditioned to think of the military budget as, well, it's for defense. It's guns, tanks, planes, protecting the country.
Right.
But he argues that's not its primary function. It's actually a hidden economic subsidy system.
This is the concept he calls military Keynesianism.
Okay, break this down for the non-economists listening. The government wants to stimulate the economy, to create jobs and spur innovation. Why not just build, say, hospitals or high-speed rail or green energy projects? Why build missiles?
There are a couple of reasons, and they're both critical to understanding the system. First, social spending is, from the perspective of the elites, dangerous.
Dangerous how?
It has a democratizing effect. If you build public hospitals, people start thinking that healthcare is a right. If you build public transport, people rely less on private auto manufacturers. It creates a public that expects things from the state and that limits the power of private corporations.
Well, missiles.
Nobody uses a missile. It's a pure waste product. It's the perfect way to pump public money into corporate hands without any messy social side effects. It stimulates the economy without changing the social structure.
It just pumps money into the accounts of high-tech corporations.
Precisely. And the second reason is even more important. It's about who takes the risk for innovation. Think about the computer you're using right now, the internet, GPS, jet engines, almost every piece of foundational high technology.
We think of Silicon Valley. Garages, brilliant entrepreneurs.
That's the powerful founding myth. But the reality is that the fundamental research and development for that core technology was not done by entrepreneurs in a garage. It was done with taxpayer money through the Pentagon system back when it was far too risky and unprofitable for private capital to touch.
So the taxpayer is basically the venture capitalist.
Yes, but a venture capitalist who never gets a return on the investment. The public pays the cost and takes all the risk of development. Then, once the technology is viable and profitable, it's handed over to private corporations like IBM or Boeing or Apple to market and sell for enormous profit.
So the Pentagon is effectively the state-managed R&D lab for the corporate sector.
Chomsky calls it the state sector of the economy, designed specifically to subsidize high-tech industry under the convenient guise of protecting us from the Russians.
Or later, the terrorists. Or China, whoever the designated enemy of the day is.
An enemy is a variable. The economic function of the Pentagon system is a constant.
But for any of this to work, the public has to go along with it.
Yeah.
We're the ones paying the taxes for it. We're the ones sending our kids to fight these wars. So why do we agree to it?
That brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the media, what he calls the auxiliary institution.
The manufacture of consent.
Yes. Chomsky spends a great deal of time in these lectures analyzing how the media frames reality to ensure public passivity. And again, it's crucial to understand he's not talking about old-fashioned censorship.
He's not saying there's a guy in a smoky room with a red pen crossing out stories he doesn't like.
No. In a free society like the U.S., that's crude and inefficient. It's much, much clearer to simply define the bounds of acceptable debate.
So you don't control the answers. You control the questions.
You control what it's possible to even think about.
Can you give me a specific example from the book?
There's a really striking one he uses involving a speech by Tomás Borge, who was a prominent Sandinista leader at the time. He gave a speech in which he said, "This revolution transcends national borders."
Okay, I have to stop you there. Because hearing that, my first reaction is, whoa. That sounds aggressive. It sounds like he's planning to invade Honduras or Costa Rica.
And that is exactly how the U.S. media framed it. They ran these sensational headlines about revolution without borders. It was used as prime evidence that Nicaragua was a military threat to the entire region and therefore a justification for funding the Contra War.
But what did he actually mean by that?
Well, if you bother to look at the full transcript of the speech, which of course Chomsky did, Borge continues the sentence. He says, "This revolution transcends borders. This does not mean we export our revolution. It is enough for us to export our example."
That's a completely different meaning.
It is the opposite meaning. He was talking about ideological influence. He was saying, we hope to inspire you, not we're coming to invade you.
But the threat narrative served the state's need to justify aggression.
Exactly. The example narrative would have undermined it completely. So the media, functioning properly within the ideological system, amplified the mistranslation and simply ignored the actual context.
And the American public is left thinking, we have to stop these guys. They're coming for us.
Exactly. That is the manufacture of consent. You don't have to lie, necessarily. You just have to frame. You select which facts matter and which ones don't. That Oxfam report praising Nicaragua's social programs?
Buried. Page 827, if it runs at all.
Right. But the mistranslated speech about revolution without borders?
That gets the headline. Front page.
That's the system at work. It's fascinating how systematic it is. It really is a machine.
Okay, let's try to map that machine out then, because Chomsky is very logical. He's a linguist, after all. He sees syntax and structure and everything.
He does.
So we've talked about the why, that's the fifth freedom, and we've talked about the what, destroying the rotten apple. But I want to map out the how. If we were to draw a flowchart of a U.S. intervention based on these lectures, what does that cycle actually look like?
It is a remarkably consistent and predictable cycle. You can pretty much overlay this map on Vietnam in the 60s, Nicaragua in the 80s, or even look at aspects of Iran today. It always starts with stage one, the trigger.
A country attempts independent development.
A country tries to use its own resources for its own people. It violates the fifth freedom.
So it could be land reform, nationalizing an industry, anything that prioritizes the domestic population over the grand area.
Right, and that immediately triggers stage two, the squeeze. The U.S. exerts enormous economic pressure. Aid is cut, loans from the World Bank and IMF are blocked, and crippling sanctions are imposed. The explicit goal, as was stated internally regarding Allende's Chile, is to make the economy scream.
The idea is to create misery. If the people are suffering, they'll turn against their own government.
You create shortages, you make sure they can't get spare parts for their tractors or medicine for their hospitals. You create misery to undermine the government's popular support.
And here's where it gets really clever.
This is the genius of the system. This leads to stage three, the feedback loop. The isolated country, desperate for trade or maybe weapons to defend itself from U.S.-backed forces, has to turn somewhere else.
And in 1986, there was only one other place to turn.
The Soviet bloc. They have to. They try to buy oil from Russia or maybe rifles from the Eastern Bloc because the U.S. and its allies have organized a complete boycott.
And the second they do that,
it triggers stage four, justification. The moment that country buys a single Soviet truck or a crate of rifles, the U.S. propaganda system points its finger and shouts, "Aha, see, we told you. They are a Soviet puppet. They're a security threat to the hemisphere."
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create the very conditions you claim to be fighting against.
It is a perfectly manufactured justification. The U.S. policy creates the very threat it then uses to justify its aggression. You force them into the arms of the enemy, and then you punish them for being there.
And the final outcome of that cycle?
The outcome is that aggression is legitimized. The U.S. attack is reframed as self-defense. We are no longer crushing a popular peasant movement. We are containing Soviet expansionism. Or, to use that incredible phrase, we are defending a country from its own people's internal aggression.
Internal aggression. That's another one of those completely Orwellian phrases that Chomsky highlights.
It's an astonishing concept. It is essentially an oxymoron. How can you commit aggression internally within your own borders? Aggression, by definition, usually means crossing a border.
Right. Germany invading Poland is aggression.
But U.S. doctrine at the time, particularly in Vietnam, defined internal aggression as a population rising up against a U.S.-backed client regime within their own country.
So if the people of South Vietnam fight against the South Vietnamese government that the U.S. installed and funded?
That is internal aggression from the point of view of U.S. planners. And therefore, the U.S. is justified in invading South Vietnam to defend the government from its own people.
It just flips the entire moral universe on its head.
It's a complete moral inversion. And this inversion is absolutely crucial for the system to work because the people managing the system and the public paying for it have to believe they are the good guys. You have to believe you are defending democracy, even while you are arming death squads that are blowing up schools and clinics.
Let's talk for a minute about the incentives here, because Chomsky is always adamant that this isn't just about bad people. It's not that Reagan or Kissinger were just uniquely evil individuals.
Yeah.
It's that the institutions they operate within select for and reward this kind of behavior.
That's right. You have to look at the actors and their institutional roles. The State Department wants control, stability, predictability. The corporations want access and profit. The fifth freedom is their prime directive. And the media, what do they want? They want access to power.
Right. If you're a journalist and you start reporting that the president is systematically lying about the Revolution Without Borders threats,
you stop getting invited to the press briefings, your sources in the White House dry up, your editor tells you you're being too ideological.
You become a radical. You get pushed to the margins.
And you're replaced by someone who understands the rules of the game. So all the incentives align to keep the official narrative within very narrow acceptable limits. You are allowed to have a vigorous debate about how to intervene. Should we send troops or should we just send money and advisors?
But you are not allowed to debate whether we have the fundamental right to intervene in the first place.
That principle is off the table. That is the unquestionable religious dogma of the state.
I want to read a specific quote from the lectures here, because Chomsky's sarcasm is, well, it's a very specific flavor of dry wit, but it really cuts to the bone. This is about that threat of a good example.
Go ahead.
He's quoting administration officials who are conceding that the goal of the U.S. terrorist attack on Nicaragua was, quote, to debilitate the Sandinistas by forcing them to divert scarce resources toward the war and away from social programs. That policy made good sense. It was directed rationally to the threat posed by Nicaragua, the threat of a good example.
It's that word rationally that always sticks with me in that passage.
Yeah, me too.
He's pointing out that within the insane logic of empire, cruelty is rational. If your overriding goal is to preserve the global hierarchy, then destroying a health clinic in a Nicaraguan village is a perfectly rational act.
Because it prevents the dangerous idea that poor people deserve health care from spreading.
It prevents a localized success from destabilizing the global system. And it reminds me so much of how we talk about sanctions today. We're often told that sanctions are a peaceful, diplomatic tool for promoting democracy. But if you apply the systems translation...
The systems translation is that sanctions are designed to degrade the public sector of a target country. If people are hungry, if the buses don't run, if the hospitals have no power, who do they blame?
They blame their government. It undermines the legitimacy of any independent political project. It serves to prove that socialism fails or that independence leads to poverty, even if, in reality, the country is being deliberately and systematically strangled.
Here's another quote that really highlights that moral inversion you talked about. He's talking about Vietnam, and the language is just so stark. He says, the U.S. was undertaking the defense of South Vietnam against the internal aggression of its own population.
There it is. The population is cast as the aggressor in their own land.
Which logically implies that the U.S., the foreign invading army, is the native or legitimate force.
In the ideological system of the state, the U.S. is everywhere by right. So if we are in Vietnam, we belong there. If the Vietnamese people resist us, they are the aggressors. It's a complete colonization of reality itself.
And we see echoes of this today, don't we? I mean, just think about how media often reports on conflicts where the U.S. is involved.
Absolutely. When a U.S. force or a U.S. ally is occupying territory and the local population fights back, what are they called?
Insurgents,
Yeah.
militants, terrorists.
Right. And what are the occupying forces called?
Peacekeepers, security forces, defenders.
The language itself dictates whose violence is legitimate and whose is inherently criminal before you even know any of the facts on the ground.
There's one last quote I want to touch on because it gestures toward the terrifying nuclear backdrop to all of this. Chomsky cites a Stratcom study. That's the U.S. Strategic Command.
The madman theory.
Exactly. The study advises, quote, we should also not portray ourselves as too fully rational and cool-headed, that the U.S. may become irrational and vindictive if its vital interests are attacked should be a part of the national persona we project.
It's just chilling to read that in an official document. This is institutionalized volatility.
That's basically saying it's good for business if everyone thinks we're a little crazy and might fly off the handle.
It is the explicit logic of a gangster. Nice little country you have here. It'd be a shame if I lost my temper. It suggests that the system benefits from appearing willing to blow up the entire world. It's not just deterrence, it's a tool of coercion, of planetary-scale blackmail.
So we have this very clear picture of the system as it operated in the 1980s. A rational imperial system designed to crush any good example in a place like Nicaragua, masking its aggression as defense, and funded by a military-industrial complex that doubles as a subsidy for high-tech industry.
Right, that's the map.
But then the Soviet Union collapsed. The Berlin Wall came down, the Cold War is over.
Oh.
So I have to play this skeptic again. Does this book, written in that specific context, still matter? Or is it just a history lesson at this point?
I think it matters more than ever. And the reason is that the Soviet Union was never the primary driver of these policies. It was the primary pretext.
The pretext. Explain that.
Remember the fifth freedom? The fundamental goal was always to maintain access to and control over the grand area. That goal did not change one bit just because the official enemy collapsed.
So the machine just kept running. It just needed a new fuel source.
The machine barely even blinked. I mean, look at what happened immediately after the Cold War officially ended. The first major U.S. military action was the invasion of Panama in 1989.
To get the dictator Noriega.
Right. But the justification shifted seamlessly. It wasn't fighting communism anymore. Suddenly, it was fighting narco-traffickers. Then, in the 90s, the pretext became humanitarian intervention. After 9/11, it became the war on terror. Today, it's about containing China.
The enemy changes, but the logic of intervention remains constant.
The institutional logic remains exactly the same. You still need to control the grand area. You still need to use the Pentagon budget to subsidize high-tech industry. In fact, that's more important than ever with global competition. And you still need to manufacture consent from the public for all of it.
You could even argue the manufacture of consent is more efficient now with social media and the 24-hour news cycle.
I would absolutely argue it is. The spectrum of acceptable debate is still incredibly narrow, maybe even narrower. Think about the debates we see on cable news or in major newspapers regarding foreign wars today. We argue intensely about tactics.
All right, should we send drones? Should we use special forces? What's the proper exit strategy?
All-consuming debates. But how often do you hear a mainstream voice ask the fundamental question, do we have the legal or moral right to be intervening in this country in the first place?
That question is almost entirely outside the bounds of expressible thought.
It's treated as absurd, naive, or unpatriotic, just as it was in 1986 regarding Nicaragua. The system is incredibly resilient.
And what about the domestic side? That crisis of democracy that Chomsky touches on, where he mentions that even in the 80s, large parts of the population were effectively disenfranchised.
Yeah, he cites mainstream political science studies from the time, like those by Martin Gylens, showing that for the bottom, say, 50% of earners, their expressed preferences had effectively zero influence on policy outcomes. Their representatives simply did not vote in accordance with their interests.
Which sounds a lot like the plutocracy or oligarchy analysis that has become much more common today.
It's the direct lineage. This profound disconnect where the government serves the fifth freedom of corporate interests, while the general public feels completely ignored, is exactly what fuels modern political disengagement, cynicism, and the rise of various forms of populism.
People know the system isn't working for them.
They know it viscerally, even if they don't have the systems theory language of the grand area to explain precisely why.
They can feel the fifth freedom at work in their own lives, even if they don't call it that.
Exactly. They see the massive bailouts for banks after 2008, but budget cuts for their local schools and libraries. That's the fifth freedom in action, right at home.
This brings us right back to the name of this project, Crisis in Perception.
Yes.
This deep dive really is a perfect illustration of that crisis. We're conditioned to perceive defense when what we are actually seeing is aggression. We perceive news when what we are seeing is ideological management.
And we perceive democracy when what we are often seeing is a highly effective system of elite management and population control.
Chomsky makes a really interesting and counterintuitive point about who is the most deluded in this system. We tend to have this image that the uneducated masses are the ones being brainwashed by propaganda.
But he argues almost the complete opposite. He argues that it's the intellectuals, the educated professional classes, the people with advanced degrees who write the op-eds and teach the university classes, who are often the most thoroughly indoctrinated.
Why would that be? That seems completely backwards. Shouldn't more education make you more critical of power?
You would think so. But you have to consider the institutional role of the educated class. They are the managers of the ideological system. They're the ones tasked with articulating and justifying the actions of the state.
They're the high priests of the secular religion.
In a sense. And to get ahead in those institutions, in elite universities, in major media outlets, in government bureaucracies, you have to internalize the values of the system. You have to genuinely believe that the U.S. is fundamentally a benevolent force in the world, or you simply won't get hired. You won't get tenure. You won't be given the newspaper column.
Whereas the guy working 2 jobs to pay his rent.
He isn't paid to believe the myth. In fact, his daily life often contradicts it. He's often much more skeptical and realistic about power because he's on the receiving end of it. He might be distracted by other things or marginalized from the political conversation, but he hasn't necessarily swallowed the official story the way the experts have.
That is a very humbling thought for us so-called experts having this conversation.
It should be. It's a constant warning.
So, after all of this, where does it leave us? We've just mapped out this enormous, all-encompassing system. It seems to control the economy, the military, the media. It has this proven track record of crushing good examples. Honestly, it can feel a bit deterministic. It can feel like there's nothing that you or I can actually do about it. The machine is just too big.
It can absolutely feel that way. It's designed to feel that way. But Chomsky ends the lectures on a very different note. And I think this is the most crucial takeaway. He flips that sense of hopelessness completely upside down.
How does he do that?
Think about it for a second. Why does this massive, complex, and incredibly expensive system of propaganda, the media, the schools, the think tanks, the entire public relations industry, why does it all exist?
To control how we think, to manage us.
Right. But if the elites were truly all-powerful, if the public were truly irrelevant and powerless, they wouldn't need to control our minds. They would just use force. The very existence of this vast manufacture of consent machine is the greatest proof that they are terrified of us.
If we didn't have power, they wouldn't spend billions of dollars a year trying to distract and confuse us.
Exactly. The entire system is predicated on our consent. It relies on our passivity. It relies on us not looking at the map we just drew. It relies on us believing the defense narrative and not seeing the fifth freedom at work.
So the crisis in perception is the actual battleground.
It is the only battleground that really matters. The moment you look at a headline about some dangerous enemy overseas, and you learn to ask the question, wait a minute, are they a genuine military threat, or are they a good example that the system needs to crush?
Yeah.
In that one moment, the manufacturing of consent breaks down for you.
You start looking for the fifth freedom in every story.
You start seeing the underlying structure.
Yeah.
And that is the one thing the system cannot tolerate. It relies on its own invisibility. And once you see the map, you can't unsee it. That is the real danger to them. And that, I think, is the real hope for us.
Well, I certainly feel like I've had my own perception shifted today. It's a lot to process, but it feels like a necessary toolkit for just looking at the world as it is.
It's about seeing the machine and not just the puppet show it produces.
We're going to wrap it up there. This has been a heavy one, but a really important one. This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon. For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini-explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.